Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's European Food Community of Practice Roundtable discussion. My name is Natasha Vlahu from Resus Brands, a partner of the EEF-COP project, and I will be your moderator today. Our focus today is resilience in the food supply chain and where food product cares, exploring the intersection between SecureFood findings and the EEF-COP expertise. We'll begin with an overview of the SecureFood project, followed by insights on food system resilience and fraud points, and then we will move to a panel discussion on where resilient gaps and fraud vulnerabilities overlap. Let me mention at this point that this discussion will be recorded. Thank you for joining, and let's get started. We begin with a brief project overview of the SecureFood project. Our first speaker is Ben Moore. Ben is a senior EU project manager with CAR Communications in Ireland and dissemination and communication manager for the SecureFood project. He has 20 years of experience working on Horizon projects, leading strategic communication and stakeholder engagement. Ben, the floor is yours.
That's great. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone that was able to make this call today. Really looking forward to it. And hopefully there'll be some fruitful discussions between our two projects. Is it okay if I share my screen for my PowerPoint presentation?
Of course.
Perfect. One moment. Oh, sorry. Sorry, just bear with me one moment. My laptop is being very slow. Okay, perfect. Can everybody see my screen okay?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, so just to reiterate again, thank you everyone for joining today. My name is Ben Moore. I am a senior EU project manager with CAR Communications Limited, based in Dublin, Ireland, where we have over 20 years of experience in providing communication and dissemination expertise to EU-funded projects. On the SecureFood project, I am the communication and dissemination manager, and I'm also joined by my CAR Communications colleague, Annalie Cathier, who also provides communication and dissemination expertise to the SecureFood project. So looking first at what SecureFood is. So in a nutshell, SecureFood is an integrated approach to enhance food systems resilience, advocating for food security and an uninterrupted food supply. It's a 42-month Horizon Europe project under the call Horizon CL6 2023 Farm to Fork 01. The project duration is 3.5 years and is funded by the European Union with just under €8 million in funding. And as you can see from the graphic on the right-hand side here, we have a wide variety of partners, 25 in total, and their affiliate organizations from across Europe. So looking then at why secure food matters. Well, food systems today, they function as complex global networks. So what happens in one part of the world, whether it's a drought, a trade restriction, or a logistics delay, can have ripple effects across entire regions, across Europe and beyond. There are key pressures, of course, undermining food security. Europe's reliance on external trade, for example, makes our food supply sensitive to geopolitical or market disruptions. The past few years have made these vulnerabilities impossible to ignore. During COVID-19, for example, we saw transport bottlenecks, labor shortages, and even temporary shortages of essential goods on our shelves. Events such as these highlight how quickly local or regional crises can escalate into global instability. And so secure food directly contributes to the goals of the strategies of the EU Green Deal and Farm to Fork strategy by helping to translate policy ambition into practical evidence-based tools and frameworks that can strengthen Europe's ability to anticipate, absorb, and recover from future disruptions. So now that we've looked at why our food systems are vulnerable, we're going to now turn to how SecureFood is addressing those challenges. So the foundation of SecureFood is scientific knowledge, both existing and new. In our project, we're bringing together research from across multiple disciplines to understand what makes food systems resilient and how that resilience can be measured and strengthened. But of course, resilience isn't something that can be achieved by science alone. It's also about collaboration. SecureFood takes a multi-actor approach involving policymakers, producers, industry, and civil society to make sure that the tools and frameworks we develop are realistic, inclusive, and are reflective of real-world needs. Finally, we're complementing that science and collaboration with technology. SecureFood is developing digital tools that will help to analyze vulnerabilities, model future scenarios, and support decision-making that enables users to test different resilience strategies, forecast disruptions, and monitor system performance. So taken together, these three pillars form what is the backbone of SecureFood's approach to the challenges we addressed earlier. They're interconnected and mutually reinforcing, allowing the project to bridge research, policy, and practice to strengthen Europe's food system for the long term. And then at the heart of SecureFood lies a set of 4 dynamic case studies that will serve as co-creation hubs that is designed to demonstrate, test, validate, and refine the project solutions. So you can see here we have case study 1, which is grain in Ukraine. Case study 2, fruits and vegetables in Portugal. We have case study 3, which is fish and aquaculture in Greece and Belgium. And then we have case study 4, which is milk and dairy products, also in Greece and in Finland. So with the proposed solutions that we mentioned earlier, including the project's frameworks, models, and digital tools across different food supply chains, regions, and levels of disruption, what these case studies are in essence is they form the cornerstone of the project's co-development approach, bringing together technical partners and stakeholders to ensure that the solutions developed are practical, impactful, and aligned with both the real-world needs and the challenges that are faced by the end users of this project. Each case study listed here will focus on a specific food supply chain and distinct geographic contexts that provide a representative, cross-section of the broader European food system, from the grain production affected by the war in Ukraine to the handling of perishable fruits in Portugal. Each case study will guide the development of the SecureFood solutions, including, among others, digital twins, early warning systems, resilience modeling, and observatory dashboards. So that was just a brief overview of the SecureFood project and what we're aiming to do and the challenges we address. If we do have any other questions, we can raise them during the roundtable discussion at the end. But thank you for your attention. And now I will hand it over to my SecureFood colleague, Luca.
Thank you, Ben. Of course, now we will turn to Luca Orsioli, Adjunct Professor of Supply Chain Management at the MIT Zaragoza International Logistics Program. In the SecureFood project, Luca is the principal investigator leading work on foresight analysis, risk interdependency mapping, and machine learning tools for predicting supply chain disruptions. So, Luca, please go ahead.
Thank you both. I'm sharing my screen now, so can you please just confirm that you can see my slides?
Yes.
So it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the introduction. The agenda that I have prepared for today covers points related, starting a little bit to warm up on how we see food supply chains and how we typically cluster those in terms of managerial requirements. Then I will describe the problem of managing these food supply chains in what we call VUCA environments. And then I will dig into more into details into the SecureFood project with a focus on the tasks that we have related to foresight and improving forecasting to improve resilience. I will also provide a preview of some of the results that we have from our foresight analysis which consists of developing scenarios for the stakeholders for the case studies that Ben just introduced, and then I will conclude by risk implications based on these foresight scenarios that we have created. So when it comes to managing food supply chains, well, I guess many of us are in the field, so you should recognize this. So basically, a food supply chain does not look maybe so complex. We need farmers, we need producers, we need food processors, manufacturers, and then you have logistics and service providers and transportation carriers that ensure that we can move food to markets. And then, of course, when we arrive to markets, then we have retailers, grocery stores, restaurants, and whoever actor is relevant for the distribution of the food supply chain. We know very well that in operation, a supply chain is meant to match demand. So whatever we produce and distribute has to match a demand from final consumers. And what I see in this graph is what you see in this graph is what typically managers use to classify food supply chain. Those are typically seen as what we call push systems. So we have very huge volumes that are being produced, which requires also heavy investments on the infrastructure and assets that are involved. And as a consequence, typically this gives volumes, but then you might have problems in handling flexibility and agility to respond to demand needs. A food supply chain is governed by steps or processes. I mean, these are defined by what we call the SCORE model. So we typically go through planning, sourcing, making, delivering, and return. And it is actually the planning phases, which is actually the one that is most sensitive to problems, because you have to forecast the demand. And based on the plans that you do, then you pass these forecasts to your supply, and then production planners and any other actors that is involved, they have to ensure that they can match that forecasted demand with the capacity of their assets. Also, something else to keep in mind also is the fact that when we look at a supply chain, we typically tend to have several views. So we do see the management of materials, which is typically the flow that goes from left to right. But then you have also information and finance, and the information is data that is available in the supply chain. This has to be typically available to all actors. If there are visibility problems, then we end up in different types of problems, as we will discuss in a moment. And then, of course, the economic part is also essential here because there are some struggles. Typically, money comes from the markets, typically, which means that all the actors that you have in the upstream part of the supply chain, they might not get paid instantly as soon as they consume the resources that they have. So in that sense, they need to invoice. There are invoice payment times to sustain, and then very often you might not have the liquidity that is necessary to run your supply chain. So for that reason, you typically have other actors that are belonging to the supply chain. So we talk about authorities, banks, credit institutions, and insurances also are actually part of this. The banks and credit institutions, they help in ensuring that we have the financial liquidity, otherwise we risk to bankrupt. Otherwise, insurance company, typically they ensure to help, they help us handling any type of incidents that might happen in the supply chain. And then they assure that we are covered up to some point. And finally, the authorities, they come with healthy and safety and security certifications. So it's pretty much a complex world just by that. If we now look at some statistics, as I was saying, I mean, we're trying to match supply with demand. So we can maybe wondering how does it looks like in Europe when it comes to supply and demand. Well, what we do see is that we have actually quite a strong production of food. So we have a turnover of 3.8 trillion of euro with a value adding of almost 1 trillion. We have a lot of companies working in this sector, 9 million enterprises according to the figures that we have in Eurostat. And also these companies offer quite some employment. So this is a very important sector of our economy. So basically, just in agriculture, almost 8 million people, food and drink services, 6.5 million, and so on. Something else that we can notice is that the produced volumes are steadily increasing. I mean, since the statistics that we have here in the last 8 years, we can see that food and drink industry are steadily increasing. Somehow pointing out the importance of the sector. So more or less, we can say that, of course, we have the capacity to produce food, and this capacity has to match with demand. And demand typically is the part of the supply chain that is distributing food. If we look at the distribution domestically, then it typically goes directly to our households. It can go to recreation and culture sector. Restaurants and hotels are also included into those. And then, of course, part of our production is going in the end outside Europe, so it goes for trading. But consumption-wise, also we have quite a very huge consumption. So we're thinking of, I mean, the figures show something like 13% of the households' expenditures in 2022. So it's a quite consistent part of our daily purchases. So and then of course, I mean, what you see also on the right-hand side is also the consumption on a country level, which shows that more or less we are on the same level in different countries. As I was saying, not everything is consumed domestically. Of course, something goes for trading. So, and we have capacity not just to satisfy our domestic demand, but also to export and touch countries and continents outside Europe. And from this figure, you realize that one of the main importers of European food and drinks is actually the US and Canada. So North America in general, they are the first one. And then we have second place, it goes to Greater China region, and then the North African countries. So all in all, what we see, we have supply, we have demand. The game that we are playing is trying to match whatever is demanded with our supplies. And according to what we see, as there is very profitable trading, we are able actually to produce more than what we can actually consume domestically. Well, while these are good news, there are still problems because, once again, I mean, food supply chains are actually food systems that are meant to generate significant economies of scales and high production volume. So we call these push systems. But usually when you have a push system, which means that you basically deliver whatever comes, you deliver that to the market, then you end up being not flexible. Okay, so you can think I guess you might know, I mean, many of you are experts, so you know very well that when you cannot control Mother Nature, more or less, so whatever is coming from nature, it comes in kind of quantities that we can, as long as we have allocated some assets, these are coming, so we cannot really control. But what we can do is that we can manage, and then it's up to us to ensuring that we can manage in order to distribute whatever comes from the system in a good manner. But considering that the systems are not flexible, we might end up into troubles. I mean, let's say that 1 year we produce more than we were expecting. That's an oversupply, and an oversupply can create problems. And you can think like of you might have bottlenecks in the system that you have. I mean, the system has a capacity, as I was saying, so, and some of this capacity is fixed with little flexibility sometimes. So that means that you create bottlenecks. Bottlenecks create queues and waiting times in the process, which can lead to waste. At the same time, even if we reach the market, then we can depress prices, which might result into lower margins for the actors that are part of the supply chain. The other way around, if now we end up having less materials, less quantities that we were expecting, then it's the opposite problem. Now the processing units and the processing resources will end up with being inefficient, so the utilization of those will not be at the best. And at the same time, the undersupplies and the lower quantity might increase prices, which in some way it can lead to waste, but also it can also lead your consumers in perhaps not purchasing your product, so you will reach a lower share of the market. In general, as we can understand, this kind of mismatches or potential differences in production create problems, but you might have also differences in and changes of consumer preferences and also consumer availability or access to money, which in the end might also create problems in delivering the goods on our tables. You have problems also with contamination. Once again, these are fixed supply chain. They are typically they are characterized by very short time to market, which means that these are perishable goods. So we have to be quick to move our goods across the supply chain. But the same time to market characteristics might be a problem, because if there is a contamination, then we might have already spread out our products, which can escalate any problems that can affect health of consumers. And in some cases, of course, we will have also to recollect back things and have some very costly logistics in order to return things and also to ensure that we can dispose of waste. So there are vulnerabilities, and the vulnerabilities are connected to the way the system works. And what we can do as of today, we can only see actually the tip of the iceberg. I mean, and which is typically food recalls and contamination cases. I mean, there are databases, for instance, in Europe, like the RAF system, that is collecting those. We access other statistics telling that the food waste is quite high. We're talking about in 1 year about for 58.4 million of tons that goes to waste. Also cases of food fraud that are very well known, and the numbers, maybe it's only hundreds, but this is actually what we might have knowledge of. I mean, there's probably a dark number that might be bigger than this one, and my colleague will actually focus on this aspect. And then, of course, we have supply chain inefficiencies, which, as I was saying before, I mean, can actually bring in additional shocks in our supply chains, mostly economic shocks. So what is happening as of today? Well, we are in a VUCA environment, and if you are familiar with this term, then it means that basically we are thinking of vulnerable and uncertain environments, so to speak. And if we go back in the past, since 2019, we have had quite some important events that have created volatility in the environment. Well, starting from the COVID situation, I mean, this has led to the shortages of personal protective equipment that resulted in material shortages in the healthcare. But we saw that there were shocks also in the food supply chains, and mostly what we have experienced probably is to see empty shelves in grocery stores. And this was because, once again, these are push systems, so that means that we plan and forecast in advance, and then we simply replenish. So the supply chain is set to respond to a predefined demand. But if there are sudden demand peaks, like what COVID was creating when people was panicking, then we are not able to respond to these demand peaks, and then we might end up with stockouts and lack of food. We are not limited to those. I mean, we have seen many other events, like a simple container ship that was blocking the Suez Channel. This created queues in seaports, and the queues in seaports created huge delays of up to 3-4 weeks in order to deliver products. And thinking of food supply chain, which is a product that is high perishable, 4 weeks might be actually lethal in terms of being able to deliver to your destination with fresh products. And of course, also in these periods, this was a period where freight rates were increasing, and this is also a problem for a supply chain where margins may be low, and any costs increment can actually spin and create problems to some of the actors. Then we had the Russian-Ukraine war, and that has escalated. I mean, this has led to different shortages, starting from minerals that we need today for our new technologies for digitalizing. But then, of course, the major problems that we can connect to the case of food relate to energy, and energy is an essential element that we need to run production and processing, and then wheat, export of wheat. I mean, Russia and Ukraine are actually two of the major countries, and they account exporting wheat, and they account to something like 30% of the global exports. And lately, trade tariff wars. I mean, these are touching different areas of our supply chains, but then for sure, food supply chains are also part of those. And I mean, any tariff increments and changes will ultimately affect our chains. Well, in our project, we might see different types of risks. We typically distinguish operational risks and disruption risks based on their frequency and impacts. But what is relevant for us is disruption, which is typically seen as a high impact, low probability event, which can actually result into shortages and important losses. And shortages and losses can actually have significant consequences when it comes to food. We know that it leads daily to malnutrition, humanitarian crisis, economic crisis can also be pushed by food unavailability. And then social and political. I mean, it comes from history. For instance, the Roman Empire was controlling population by providing access to wheat. And wheat was fundamental at that time. It was mainly imported by Egypt and Sicily. But when there were shortages, then this escalated into riots and protests. And actually, the fall of the empire can be connected to the lack of wheat. What is coming next? Well, many things. I mean, this is the World Economic Forum, which shows the Global Risk Perception Survey, starting from extreme weather, misinformation and disinformation, polarization effects, and cost of living crises and cyber attacks. Those were nominated as 5 of the main important trends to be considered in the future, according to a survey. And climate change is definitely at the first place, and we can tell definitely also that climate change is a problem for food supply chain. But then the question that remains, how are these risks and upcoming changes are going to affect our food supply chain? And how can we be more resilient? Well, this is what we have been trying to do in SecureFood. As Ben was anticipating, we want to create food systems that can be designed by withstanding risks and disruptions, so that we can prevent, respond, recover from different risks. In the SecureFood is doing developing different tools and analytical skills. Ourselves from CTLC, we are engaged in forecasting the future, or at least trying to do that. And we want to do foresight analysis and machine learning tools that can help in using some specific factors and parameters and data that can allow us to predict some upcoming disruptions. Of course, we are in the middle of the work, and the goal is to do it with the 4 case studies that Ben was mentioning. I will not present this slide, as Ben has already gone through that. But I will instead guide you through some of the preliminary results that comes from the foresight analysis that we have done. And I will use my 5 last minutes to go through it. Well, basically this is not the machine learning part. We are working with the machine learning algorithm, so we will have results later next year. But for the moment, we have finished the foresight analysis. So scenario forecast is something that you can do in order to predict many different things, especially when you have data, or perhaps you might miss some data that is essential for doing the analysis. And for doing this, then we decided to work with a tool called cross-impact analysis. That is a tool developed by Weimer Gelle in Germany. So we have followed this approach. The method consists of creating by determining first drivers that are expected, or projections as we call them, in order to understand what is driving change in a system. And of course, we use some of the materials from SecureFood itself. There was a task in Work Package 2 that was used as an input, but then another major input was a working document issued by the European Commission, Drivers of Food Security. So in addition, we have done literature reviews in order to start up and determine the major drivers. So what we came up with is a list of 21 drivers covering economic projections, performance of supply chains, biophysical and environmental topics, research and innovation and technology, social-cultural drivers, political and institutional drivers, and then finally demographic drivers. We also made an exercise to identify the possible variations of these drivers. And then we had workshops with the case studies in order to adapt the drivers to the cases. The results of the workshops are listed out here. Here you see on the right-hand side a typical result of the cross-impact matrix, where we report basically the interaction between the drivers. But as I was saying, as a result of the workshops, we had a selection or a change, maybe a slight change of the projection drivers that were derived from literature. And then finally, we decided together with the stakeholders how many variations we had to consider for the scenarios. And by combining those, we ended up by developing scenarios. And scenarios were made of something like slightly more than 3,000 scenarios. And then the final question for us, okay, of these 3,000 scenarios, what is relevant for us? Well, the cross-impact balance matrix allow us to make scoring and to ensure also that the high score scenarios are also consistent in order to ensure that these drivers and variations are connected in a logical manner without creating some internal contradictions or inconsistencies. So without going into details, I aim to present here the final scenarios. So this is from Belgium, where we are actually combining the drivers in a manner to create scenarios that we title Balancing Innovation and Environmental Change. So basically here, technological innovation and challenges in the environments take a significant role, and that's why the title comes from like this. But then, of course, each of these drivers has still some significance and some specific variation that characterize that specific driver. So, but this is the highest scored that we had from the aquaculture sector. Continuing in Greece, then we do see.
Luca,
Yes.
Excuse me, I'm gonna have to ask you to wrap it up a little bit.
Yes, I'm finishing. So in fish, in Greece, then we had economic volatility and still environmental challenges. The grain production and export in Ukraine is expecting a path to stability and growth for the future. And then in Greece, milk and dairy improve sustainability and a more resilient future. And in Finland, then resilience, cooperation, and technology. So all in all, these factors are part of what we call the VUCA environment, so the volatile environment in which we participate. And in this figure, what we say basically is that this VUCA environment is ultimately affecting the supply chains and also the risks and disruptions that we are expecting to see in the future. So what is left for us is now to connect these dots and then demonstrate with tools in the future to how all these factors are actually interconnected and creating these cascading effects. So all in all, I think I can wrap up here. So I hope you got the point of what we are doing. And the main message here is that basically our work is aiming and looking at forecasting, because forecasting can improve planning and ultimately support industries in improving resilience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luca. Our next speaker is Dr. Timothy Wilkes, Senior Research Scientist at the Office of the Government Chemist, FGC. Dr. Wilkes has more than 20 years of research experience, spanning analytical guidance, food authenticity, and fraud monitoring across scientific and grey literature. He also represents the EEF-COP project in this discussion. Timothy, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'll just share my screen, if that's okay. And should go on. So can everybody see that? I hope so.
Yes, we see the presenter's view actually, but I suppose it's fine. I don't know if you can see the side notes, but
It doesn't want to show the file, so in the interest of brevity, if you're happy, I'll take it from here and just go through the slides so there's less confusion over what's being presented. So I work within the Office of the Government Chemist at LGC, in which I wear many hats. I'm not a chemist, actually. I'm a geneticist who came from the field of oncology. So a lot of this is new to me, but quite exciting and interesting. And for today, I represent FAN, which is hosted at LGC and is a partner of the European Food Fraud Community of Practice, and we're Work Package 2 leaders. So briefly, I'll give an overview of what we consider as food fraud and its systematic weaknesses, cover a few of the key vulnerabilities, give you some recent examples and emerging patterns, and then try and summarize it all up in the conclusion. So food fraud, food adulteration, food crime, counterfeiting, all relate to a problem that's existed really since the commercialization of food. If we try to look for formal definitions of it, I suppose the closest comes from the SecureFood authenticity definition, which stipulates it as an intentional act for economic gain involving deception in the production or marketing of food. And if we want to look at it in more general terms, then I could refer you to an interesting paper by Spink and Meyer, who concluded that it was a collective term used to encompass the deliberate and intentional substitution, addition, tampering, or misrepresentation of food ingredients, or even food packaging, leading or false or misleading statements made about a product for economic gain. But the key features of this is it's considered an intentional and deliberate act, and it's primarily profit-driven motivation. Malicious contamination with a view to causing harm may also be considered a form of food fraud, but for the purposes of this presentation, it doesn't really fall under many of the definitions, including the SEN definition. And then if we consider what type, what are the categories of food fraud, we have the 7 basic categories. These are defined by the UK National Food Crime Unit, and you can find those on the government website. So we have adulteration, which is adding undeclared substances to reduce cost or fake the quality of something, with examples such as water in fruit juice or peanut powder in almond as a bulking agent. Substitution, where we're replacing a food ingredient with a similar but probably inferior product. Misrepresentation, where we're looking at false claims about quality, origin, or safety. Document fraud, which seems to be an up-and-coming type of fraud, which is the creating or using of false documents or packaging to market fraudulent products. Theft or diversion, so that's dishonestly obtaining food, drink, or feed products for profit. Diversion of gloves. Illegal processing, this tends mainly to be the slaughtering or preparing of meat in unapproved premises or using unauthorized techniques. And waste diversion, which is another recent intersection, which is the illegally reintroducing food meant for disposable back into the supply chain. And what are the consequences of these? Well, we have health risks, fraudulent products may contain harmful contaminants, allergens, or unauthorized additives. The big one of recent times, I think, probably was the melamine milk in baby formula, although from comparatively long time ago, industrial dyes being introduced into spices and herbs to falsely colour them, which can cause severe illness or in some cases fatality. Economic loss, where legitimate businesses can suffer financial damage due to counterfeit or adulterated goods undercutting prices. Loss of trust, when frauds expose consumer confidence in brands and food systems declines. And also trade barriers. Food fraud creates trade barriers in international trade between countries who may impose stricter checks and certifications, adding cost to you delivering that product to that market. So you take a hit from that. So what drives all this and what sort of areas within the actual food system are particularly susceptible to this? Well, partly to answer this, and post the 2013 Horsegate incident, DEFRA undertook a food fraud project in the UK to try to identify the drivers of food fraud and identify potential mitigation tools that could be applied. And this was led by Sovrani Elahi, who's the director of the Food Authenticity Network, John Spink, Chris Elliott, who produced the Elliott report on the horse meat incident, and John Points, who's the main director of the Food Authenticity Network. And what they developed was a model that basically predicted that food fraud required all of these individual components in order to be undertaken. So you required individual criminality for financial gain, macroeconomic factors such as the war in Ukraine, system weaknesses such as the length of the supply chain from Ukraine or the dairy produce from Greece. And if you removed any one of these components, food fraud wouldn't occur. But if they were all there, there's a high likelihood that food fraud would start to occur. And to look more into this, the team developed a PESTLE approach, which some of you may be familiar with, where you split up ideas into political, economic, social, cultural, technological, environment, and legal aspects. And then you use those to try and map out which drivers are most significant to the question you're trying to answer. So what causes food fraud in this incident, and what are most relevant and important in terms of addressing food policy in the immediate future. So we're looking at sort of in the next 5 to 10 years, what things are important and how can that influence policy. And they used the question, what were the global drivers of food fraud that were likely to impact the UK in this instance in the short to medium term, the 5 to 10-year period. And from this exercise, a brainstorming exercise, there were a total of 476 drivers identified, which were narrowed down to basically 41. So we had things such as political corruption, war or civil unrest. For us, the changes implemented by Brexit, again, these fell into the economic sort of drivers, as well as globalization of the food supply chain, pressures to reduce waste, climate change, the pandemic, epidemic, human or animal in that context. If we look at the sort of animal diseases such as swine fever or foot and mouth, increasing global population. We look at technical things such as increasing technical knowledge of fraudsters, novel foods, crops and varieties. We also identified various social trend drivers, such as increased food sales online, a big driver, the effect of social media influences and food fads, financial pressure, self-rationalisation, normalisation of small dishonest acts. People tend to think they're just one-offs, doesn't really matter, and it's okay. But if you multiply that up several 100,000 times, it can have a significant impact. And then sort of legal drivers, such as lack of compliance awareness or changes in legislation. And what the workshop then did was map these drivers for whether the participants thought them important, unimportant, uncertain whether they possibly occur or where they would definitely occur. And interest was focused on the top left-hand quadrant, which was the drivers were considered both important and very, very likely to occur. And these were selected and used to prioritise and act upon. And if we look at this in a little more detail, the actual sort of networks that that stood out from all of these drivers were that the areas of fragility within the general food systems within Europe were complex food supply chains where you have many intermediates, or where you had weak enforcement and limited inspection. Again, things like the Ukraine war or the Middle Eastern war, where you've got long supply chains and things are stopping to go over borders. There are multiple nodes at which criminals can intercede and interact with the goods, and fraudulent procedures can be undertaken. So that was back in 2020, just as the pandemic hit. But FAN undertook a similar foresight exercise at the recent Berlin International Food Fraud Conference as part of EEF-COP and part of our role as Work Package 2 leaders. So this a similar exercise was undertaken, but rather than just provide a question and ask participants to come up with ideas for drivers that could cause food fraud, we provided the drivers from the prioritised section to the delegates and asked them to reprioritise them, see what was still relevant in 2025 from the selection in 2020, but also to add any additional drivers that they considered important today or last month. And again, we had a similar number of drivers pulled out. Very few from the 2020 exercise were actually discarded. And the pattern we saw at the workshop was very, very similar to what we'd seen in 2020, which indicated things haven't really changed in that period of time. And the things that were highlighted again were complex supply chains where there were many intermediates, or weak enforcement and limited inspection. But the new kid on the block seems to be the impact of the development of the field of AI. And this was multifaceted in the way that people interpreted it, both in terms of criminals using AI to produce things like fraudulent documents or packaging, but also to search to see what governments may be looking at or marking, and to highlight where checks and testing may be undertaken. But it was also on the same foot that government organisations were also advocated as using AI to try and work out what the criminals were doing. So it was a two-edged sword. But in terms of the food supply systems, the basic picture that came out from all of this was that there are 6 points along the pathway from obtaining raw materials to retail products, where significant food fraud could be introduced into the chain. So that was both the sourcing of the materials, and next to this was closely associated switching of suppliers. This was particularly so where pressures on the system are sudden and excessive, such as the Ukraine war, where cereal production was reduced. We don't know what's there. People are scratching around looking for alternative suppliers to keep their products going. The lack of due diligence that may occur from that, or limited oversight, was flagged as being a significant driver for the cause of food fraud. Similarly, we have the logistics and transportation complications caused by things like that. Any point within the line where your product then is processed, repackaged, or relabeled, that's a significant node for the introduction of food fraud. And then down to the actual retail side of things, where you're looking at labeling, sort of origin claims and authenticity claims, where you might have limited evidence that something is what it is. And linked very closely to that was the use of cybercrime to actually hack systems at the end, or implement document fraud. So to expand on this, I'll now go through each of these individual areas and sort of give you some examples of what goes on with each of these. So if we look at sourcing of materials, in terms of food fraud, then we're looking at high value commodities, as these offer potentially lucrative margins if you adulterate them or mislabel them. Particularly, it was highlighted with Ukraine and Portugal and Spain supply of fruit materials, where you've got long supply chains, which involve multiple intermediaries, multiple country boundaries where things travel over. So the particular vulnerabilities in this with sourcing it, the products may originate from remote regions or multiple small suppliers. So that sort of thing would be honey from apiaries, where you might not have one large beekeeper, you might have lots of little ones, and they all send their products to one individual area. So you've got your supply is spread out over a very wide area. So it's very difficult to keep tabs on what comes from where. Or where, as I highlighted before, you have to switch to a new or an unknown source very quickly. If your supply source is disrupted, or you're having to upscale production of your product very, very quickly. So in the event of climate change, geopolitical events, or disease. And the exploitation routes that are flagged as primarily being involved with sourcing materials are things like substitution, where you're replacing genuine ingredients with cheaper ones. You know, you're using cheaper cuts of fish for expensive, particularly where skin is removed. One white fish fillet looks very much like another white fish fillet. Adulteration, mixing in cheaper ingredients, cheaper oil into extra virgin olive oil. And this can have quite serious side effects. I mean, many of you will probably remember the incidents of mineral oil being mixed with olive oil in Spain and the deaths that arrived from that. Or false origin or false certification, where products are supposed to come from a premium region or flagged as organic when they're clearly not. And a recent example is illustrated here. This was an article in The Guardian, I believe, where organic pistachios produced in Spain were found to be mixed with conventional nuts, yet sold under false certification. And then if we look at switching supplier, which again I said is linked to incidents where your supply suffers a delay, or your production goes up and you need to keep count. An onboarding of new suppliers quickly without thorough auditing history is a key area where fraud can slip in. So they're typically where businesses face supply shortages or surging demand, or where you're rapidly scaling and may stretch your existing controls, record keeping, or quality assurance. The routes to exploitation here are offering the too good to be true deals from a new contract, and then they deliver substandard or mislabeled or diverted goods, and also exploiting gaps in contracts. So frequently contracts have precise specifications, but it may be that on the onboarding process with a new supplier, these aren't checked, and it's a way through that criminals can introduce substandard grubs. Recent examples would be, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic, the increased noted substitution in seafood products, with up to 40% of white fish fillets not being what they were supposed to be. And this was flagged in the European Commission report in 2021. And then we get to logistics and transportation. So the areas of vulnerability here are where you have long supply chains with multiple intermediaries. So where you have processors and packaging. And the example I gave with honey is you tend to have lots of individual small producers, and then they combine their products, and then that product goes on to a processor. So you've got lots and lots of nodes at which people can introduce fraudulent products, such as adding beet sugar to your honey, where documentation and tracking is often weak, particularly where you have to cross borders, and where goods move quickly between different jurisdictions. Exploitation routes here typically involve theft of high value products in transit, and these are then diverted back into the black or grey market. Substitution or relabeling of goods while they're in transit. So you move them to a country that's flagged of being a premium supplier, and you tag your goods then with that label from that country. Or, as I'll give an example of in a minute, the employing fake buyer identities or distribution hubs to collect goods. And the big recent example here was in October 2024, in an incident that's become known as the Great British Cheese Heist, where fraudsters stole more than £300,000 sterling worth of high value cheddar cheese from Neal's Yard, who are a well-known London-based distributor. This was apparently an official company that was set up that were going to distribute to French supermarkets. And the cheese was produced and delivered there, and then no money was received for this, and in effect, the goods disappeared totally. The company was found not to exist. So quite a disturbing finding in terms of the effect that your logistics and your transition can have. And then similarly, your processing and repackaging. So once your raw material is processed and repackaged or blended, there is opportunities for adulteration or mislabeling, where you're using outsourced packaging or you're using a third-party co-packer, where oversight may be weaker. There's the opportunity for adulteration and substitution to creep in there. And traceability becomes a lot harder when you're using materials from lots of different sources and when they're potentially blended. The typical exploitation routes seen here are with the mixing of low grade material into premium grade and passing off as high quality. So the example I gave before, low quality oil sold as virgin olive oil, or mislabeling the origin, quality grade, etc., through the forging of certificates, or using false seals on lorries and products. And recent examples include the July 2024 case where 380 tons of olive oil was seized in Italy, and where it was declared as olive oil, but was actually comprised of blends of much cheaper oil. And if when we actually get to the retail side of things, so labeling, origin claims, authenticity, you've got consumers facing claims, so they want to know the origin, the species, is it organic, is it wild caught? These may be very hard to verify by the retailer or the consumer. The reliance on documentation supplied may be weak. Premium value claims make attractive targets. Product X is wild caught. It will demand a premium value, and if it's actually just been relabeled or diverted so you can't tell where it comes from, that's a potential node for the introduction of food fraud. Typically, the exploitation routes include labeling of goods as premium, as I said, species substitution, cheaper fish sold as expensive fish, special certification using false certificates, or underfilling packaging, an act that's now become known as premiumizing. So your goods are actually subweight. And recent examples of these include the investigation into honey, the widespread adulteration or mislabeling of many UK retailers under suspicion. That was reported in The Guardian last November. And maple washing in Canada, that was another one that was posted, and that was in the New York Post in September 2025. Finally, we have the document fraud or cybercrime, where in terms of document, it's where you have a heavy reliance on paper-based documentation rather than digital versions, and where you get limited auditing of the certification and supplier provided documents. Information technology aspects, this is where you've got more of a dependence on digitization of supply chains, but without robust cybersecurity, that's as weak as your heavy reliance on paperwork. The hacking of systems by criminals now seems to be a case of not if, but more a case of when. And a lot of companies have not yet woken up to the fact that they really need to be rigorous with implementing their cybersecurity. Exploitation routes, while we document fraud, it's forging of health or safety certificates to pass inspections, or using counterfeit packaging and labels supported by fraudulent documentation. This actually is something that's coming to the fore with the rediversion of waste products or secondary products back into the food chain. With cybercrime, it tends to be the hacking, traceability of blockchain systems to alter the origin or the quality, or phishing attacks, which was in effect what happened with the Neal's Yard cheese incident. And again, recent examples were the July 2024 olive oil mislabeling in Italy, and as I mentioned, the Great British Cheese Heist back in October 2024.
And Timothy, could I kindly ask you to wrap it up?
Yep, okay, quickly. So in terms of where can you go to look at this and get some idea of where things come from, the Food Authenticity Network posts research methods on looking for food fraud, provides guides and reports, and also guidance on standardization. Where can you start? Well, I would suggest you look at a very neat paper that was produced by John Spinks in 2019, and it was flagged by Salvarani, and it basically gives you 10 questions you can ask yourself in terms of implementing food fraud methods. The Food Authenticity Network partners with various other organisations within the UK, particularly the UK food crime units, both the national one and the Scottish one, and the Food Intelligence Network, to look at what's going on and the levels of food crime that are actually happening at the time. And what is the evidence of food crime at the moment? Well, if we look at the data over the last year, the number of food fraud reports has stayed more or less static, which tends to indicate that there's a strong controlling influence by the mitigation actions that are being taken at the moment. But if we combine this with the food safety reports over the year, we can see that it's still increasing. There's been a gradual tick up of the number of reports of food crime, both food fraud and food safety. So what does that mean now? Well, probably we can take it as that food fraud is not just about one bad actor. It's enabled by weak points at many stages of the supply chain, which I try to indicate. Recent patterns show elevated risk in premium foods, particularly things like olive oil, organic products and seafood. The fraudsters are getting increasingly sophisticated in impersonating buyers and creating fictitious clients. And the typical hotspots now include the areas to look at: sourcing of your raw materials from poorly audited suppliers, the quick switching or adding of suppliers without due diligence, logistics and transport, things where you may have to cross many borders and there may be weak oversight, processing and repackaging, and retail, where customers rely on claims which may not be independently verified. I just wanted to acknowledge Director of the Food Authenticity Network, Salvarani Elahay, and the executive team who run that network. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Timothy. Thank you all for your presentations. We will now move into a guided discussion examining where resilient challenges and food vulnerabilities intersect. This is going to be a short discussion because we took a lot of our time in our presentations, but let's talk about the first question is addressed to Luca. Based on the SecureFood work, which parts would you say of the European food system appear most vulnerable under future risk scenarios?
Yes. Well, overall, I think that the farming part of the food supply chain is the one that, according to what we think, of course, is mostly exposed to threats. I mean, and especially when it comes to climate change and economic volatility. I mean, those are expected to be under pressure in the coming years. I mean, also, I was thinking in terms of security vulnerabilities, according to Timothy's presentation, you can think much of these farmers are established in rural areas, which are typically easy targets for any kind of antagonistic attacks. Of course, I mean, it implies some level of sophistication to manipulate things and change, but still, I mean, if now these end up being vulnerable, there's a chance to have open doors. So yeah, that's in essence what I think could be the vulnerable parts. And then, of course, I mean, we need to think generically, it depends on the geographic context and the level of vulnerability that we are considering for a potential target.
Makes sense, actually. From the food fraud side, Timothy, where do you see resilience gaps becoming entry points for food fraud in today's supply chains?
Well, I would tend to agree with my colleague there, Luca, in that it's any system where you've got a lengthy distribution process. So farming, definitely where you have multiple nodes, and any point at which a product going through the system halts or needs to be inspected or looked at, there's a chance for it to be diverted or interfered with, and it can be a double link. It can be the geopolitical, so things like the grain study. I think that's really typifies it, where due to the geopolitical situation there isn't entire transparency about what's actually, in terms of grains and cereals, what's actually there, and the bottlenecks in the transport as well. You know, the Black Sea, where things are moving down there and then they halt and then they have to be transported. I think those sort of areas, definitely where you've got an extended supply chain, are very vulnerable to food fraud.
Yeah. The next question is on forecasting warning signs. Luca, let's start with you. What early warning indicators can signal both weakening resilience and increased fraud risk?
Okay, so when it comes to resilience problems, of course, early warning, again, we're talking about climate change. Overall, we do see, well, one should distinguish sudden events from chronic events. I mean, sudden events can be a peak in precipitations or some freezing event, or, I mean, these things can affect the production of soils or the farming activities related to milk and dairy. But these are disruptions that are limited in time. What we actually may struggle a little bit is what we call chronic events, I mean, which is a change in temperature of 1 degree per year, and which means that on a long distance term, I mean, 40, 50 years, we might have a lot of problems. I mean, so yes, early warning signals, we can spot them today. The challenge is more on the long-term signals and how this could be included in the planning and in the setup of the supply chains. When it comes to signaling, we have a lot of data that is being collected. It comes in different forms and different level of quality. So that we are struggling in keeping a good quality in order to use those effectively in our forecasting algorithms. When it comes to fraud, well, you can think of many different things. I mean, from the economic situation, where strict economic times may lead people to commit illicits or more illegal operations. I mean, the more you are in troubles, the more there's a chance that somebody may do something wrong. And also sometimes new regulations. I mean, new regulations come into place. And you know that for sure somebody will not be able to apply, or perhaps they do not interpret the regulations in the correct manner, or too strict regulations can actually force the market to take some inevitable actions to avoid some bankruptcy. I mean, we recall, for instance, the Volkswagen scandals with the engine emissions that were faked, and of course, I mean, it was wrong, but the regulations for the diesel emissions were too strict. So these can be early warning indicators, I would say. Yeah.
Yes. Timothy, would you like to add your viewpoint on this?
I mean, in terms of what FAN tends to look at through the platforms that we ascribe to, then ours are more short term, and what you would well, Lucas defined as sharp signals. So things like input output imbalances. You know, you look at the market and where you can see that a product, well, how would you phrase it? Yeah, your harvest, you're outputting more than is being harvested or collected. So a mass imbalance, or potentially price spikes or unusual price divergences, which are seen on the markets. You know, where retail prices diverge significantly from wholesale prices, that for us would be a signal that something was going on, potentially adulteration, or other sort of market markers would be where you see a rapid turnover of new suppliers. That could potentially be an area that's flagged up for food fraud. And linked to that, you can have things like we see rising complaints about quality coming through, which means oversight of your production or supply chain is starting to fall off, and the resilience is dropping, and the occurrence of food fraud is going up. So those sort of shorter term markets are what we look at.
Thank you. Let's turn to foresight and analytics. Luca, you mentioned the models that you applied. How can foresight and modeling tools support earlier detection and response to fraud vulnerabilities?
Well, they can help with the planning of the supply chain. I mean, we typically, when we do supply chain management, we start always with a plan, which means that I forecast the demand, and then I match that demand with the capabilities of my supply chain to match the demand. And then depending on how I can match with my supply capabilities, then I may decide whether to invest in new assets or perhaps be more agile and flexible with the workforce, or asking workers to be overtime in the production lines. And these things can be done to respond to the demand. But the problems comes if my forecasts are wrong, and if they are very wrong, then I may end up in stocking out or perhaps in overproducing. So the tools that help us in improving anything that can help us in improving the forecast and reducing the biases of the forecasts may ultimately improve my decision making. I mean, starting from as of today, a majority of us is using time series forecasts, which basically are based on historical events, but these are quite linear. So nowadays, using machine learning and AI can help in going to the non-linear field, I would say, which means that I can be able to spot sudden peaks and changes of demand and be able to integrate those in my forecasts. We also in SecureFood are looking in the foresight analysis, which means that if you don't have data about past events, you can still create some forecast that is based on events that never happened before. Which is a limit of typically modeling tools, but the foresight instead open up and create a space of new things that should be there on the planning, and should be considered in the setup of the supply chain.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next theme and information sharing. Timothy, what barriers currently limit information flow between resilience planning and food fraud intelligence communities?
Good question. I think the one thing that you see come up again and again and again is what tends to be termed as organizational silos, where the people reporting belong in different units, and the different units may have different mandates or reporting lines, and this can reduce information sharing practices, different priorities as well. Resilience planners tend to look at sort of system-wide disruption, like pandemics, natural disasters, whereas your food fraud analysts are looking more at intentional adulteration type things. So I think the different priorities between the different groups can be a big thing. And then something else that might affect it, I think these days, is sort of data sensitivity and data confidence. You know, you start talking about food fraud for your company, and that is politically, commercially, a very sensitive item that might damage your reputation. So I think a lot of companies are a bit reticent about sharing information that may indicate that they have a higher occurrence of food fraud than their competitors. I think that those are significant barriers to information exchange.
Very interesting. Luca, do you want to share your thoughts on that?
Well, I think I'm pretty much aligned with my colleague. Overall, what one can see is the possibility. This food supply chains very often we're talking about supply chains that typically use the innovation of external firms. I mean, they don't typically work with innovation themselves, but they typically exploit and consume the innovation. Which means that this may become difficult in terms of collecting data, sharing it in a standardized format. This might be some technological barriers which may hinder the access to information. And once again, accessing information and having it ready in the right format can speed up the operations for planning and setting up resilience. And then confidentiality and sensitivity is to be honest, high priority in the list. I mean, if you have been subject to insiders that have manipulated your labels, is not something that you will share to the first that come and ask. So, and especially, it's sensitive for the brand. It can affect your insurance premiums. So there are many disadvantages. So that I think it's a very important question. And it is something maybe to consider as a future challenge to uptake in research.
Excellent. I'd like to close the discussion with one final question addressed to both of you. First to Luca. What is one practical step the food industry can take now to improve both systems resilience and fraud prevention?
Okay, so, well, easy things can be done. Like ensuring the security of your system. Avoid the insider problem is one of the typical ones, right? So it's very easy that you have personnel inside. So a simple background check and background screening of employees is always something that that should be considered. But then otherwise, in general, from resilience, I would think of like the information systems that we are developing. They can be actually something that could be used. Just to get a sense about what early warnings are out there and how they can be used for improving your planning.
Timothy, the same for you, please.
Yeah, I sort of would advocate the same as my colleague there, but I think really one big driving point would be implementing shared real-time data on traceability for both sort of what would you call it, quality deviations and supply chain disruptions, because that would definitely accelerate faster detection. I think it's this lack of communication that's the big thing on the key aspects that enable us to identify what's going on far quicker than we have done up till date.
Thank you very much. Fantastic contributions. We've seen clear alignment between resilience planning and fraud prevention, and a strong need for shared intelligence, collaboration, and proactive tools. Thank you all for joining, and we look forward to continuing this work together. For those of you from the SecureFood project or the participants watching this, make sure to join the EEF-COP community. Have a great day. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.